Hey everyone, Pastor Caleb here again with another scripture study as we kind of navigate our way through what the Lord's Supper is and how it looks in this global pandemic COVID-19 era of the world's history that we are in right now. And the section of scripture I want to study with you today is from Psalm 137. The first 4 verses of Psalm 137. I'll read those and then we'll get a little bit of context and study it. The psalmist writes, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land?" So to give you a little bit of context for these words from the Psalms, this comes from the Babylonian exile. This is an era in nation of Israel's history where they were taken away from the promised land, from Jerusalem, and brought into the land of Babylon. And this psalm is a psalm of lament. They were in Babylon and they wept when they remembered Zion, which was how they talked about Jerusalem and their land, the promised land. They remembered the land that was theirs and it brought tears to their eyes. But not just because they craved to be in a land that they loved, but because their worship was inextricably tied to that piece of land. See, in Jerusalem was the temple, and the temple was the centerpiece of Old Testament worship. Without the temple, Old Testament worship couldn't happen the way God had prescribed it. And so these Old Testament Christians were there in Babylon, away from the temple, unable to worship the way that God had told them to worship, and it brought tears to their eyes. In fact, when the Babylonians, who were their captors, their tormentors, they say, demanded that they sing some of their songs of worship, they said, we can't. We can't sing our songs when we're not by the temple. We can't sing our songs when we're not allowed to worship the way that we want to worship. So what does this teach us? Well, for us in a context where we are not able to gather together to worship the way God has prescribed for us to worship, that we would gather together and as part of our worship, take the Lord's Supper. It should lead us to do a couple things. It should lead us, first of all, to remember that this isn't the first time that this has happened to the church. This obviously happened in the Babylonian exile, but there have been other times in the church's history where the church has not been able to worship together the normal way that God had prescribed for a number of reasons. Some of them were epidemics. Some of them were government inflicted. Some of them were caused by things that were completely out of their control. So as we try to navigate this time in the church's history, let's always keep that in the forefront of our mind. This is not the first time that this has happened, and therefore it's not going without God's oversight and control. God is allowing this to happen. He has his church in mind. And just like those people from the nation of Israel in Babylon knew that eventually God would release them and God would bring them back to their land so that they could worship again, we can know the same thing. God will bring us back together. He promised that he will. He promised that his church would continue until Jesus came back. We have that absolute certainty. And so let's look forward to it, knowing that we don't have to practice the Lord's Supper while we're in this exile, you might call it, to be good Christians, but that we long for that rejuvenation, that refilling of our worship life when we're able to gather together. But this verse also ought to lead us to examine ourselves, as Paul told us to do in 1 Corinthians, and as we did the last time when we studied Amos chapter 8. It should lead us to examine ourselves and ask ourselves, when I'm not able to worship with my congregation, how does that make me feel? For these Christians, it led them to weep when they remembered their worship space that they could not be to. It led them to not be able to sing songs of joy because they could not be in their land. I wonder if sometimes we struggle with that in North American Christianity. That we see church as an option on Sunday morning, not as a given. That we see Bible study as a have to rather than a get to. That we see the Lord's Supper as sort of a bonus, but not a necessity. And I don't know where you're at on any of those issues, But I think every one of us needs to take some time to reflect on those things. Maybe this COVID-19 crisis is God refocusing our minds to get us to see the things that we took for granted, so that we can weep over those things. Maybe literally, maybe just feeling the craving of wanting to be together again. So that when God restores us back to our regular worship life, we are overjoyed to see each other, that we embrace each other and smile and sing songs of joy because God has been good to us and allowed us to worship the way that He prescribed once again. So as we think about how to navigate COVID-19 as a congregation, we remember this is only temporary, and that it is building up for us a longing to be with each other again and to receive the Lord's gifts with each other. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next time.